Today's food systems are under threat from growing populations, wars and extreme weather conditions. If we carry on at this rate, we won't be able to feed ourselves. And according to a recent UN report on climate change, we've got 12 years to avoid absolute disaster. Does South Africa have enough young farmers to feed our booming population? And do our opaque land reform policies exacerbate the problem? And later in the show, the legal profession's degrading election, or a step in the right direction. The quota system is now in full play in the body governing advocates and attorneys, which means that representatives will be chosen on race and sex and possibly not merit. Some in the legal profession say this is unconstitutional. What do you think? We'll hear arguments from all sides and take your questions. Join the conversation. Call us on 011-759-6340 or tweet us on #TonightWithJane Dutton. But first, Shahan has your news.
Thanks, Jane. Appreciate it. These are our top stories tonight. VBS Mutual Bank is rotten and can't be saved. Those are the words from advocate Terry Motau, who led the investigation into the bank's collapse. His report also recommends that those involved be criminally charged. Nearly 2 billion rand was squandered by dozens of people over 3 years. The looting took place when the bank was placed under curatorship between 2015 and earlier this year due to a liquidity crisis. The co-founder of the bank denies any knowledge of wrongdoing.
I didn't know that there was such things happening in the bank. You know, and I give myself credit to that because I ask myself, is it because maybe I am stupid that I couldn't see that happen? But if I realize that it also went under the nose of the South African Reserve Bank Supervisory Department, which supervises the bank, and also the two big audit firms, you know, then I give myself credit and say, yeah, the people who have done this are really professional.
Now, I'll be speaking to the VBS investigator advocate Terry Motau on NewsHour at 10. It's bound to be a very interesting conversation about the dodgy dealings at the bank. Join me tonight at 10 on NewsHour for that. Other news now, the first witness in Pastor Timothy Omotoso's trial has detailed the sexual abuse she suffered. Cheryl Zondi told the court she was told not to mention the assault because Omotoso was a man of God. The 22-year-old was 13 at the time. The Nigerian evangelist apparently controlled his victims' movements and wouldn't allow them to socialize with people from the outside world. Omotoso and his co-accused have refused to plead. They face 63 charges, including rape and human trafficking.
Find out if she came into the room when I was busy rehearsing with the rest of Grace Galaxy, and she was saying, Oguti, you'd better make him happy. You know, basically coaching us on how to handle ourselves when we are summoned. That we better not waste time when we go up there. We need to do this and that. We need to dress nicely, you know, look sexy and all of that. So that was her role. She was going around coaching girls on how to please him.
You are mentioning something.
And the Energy Department is considering a proposal to stop setting the retail price of 93-octane petrol. It will instead put a price ceiling in place. The department says the move will create competition, possibly making it cheaper. It says people are unnecessarily using 95 unleaded petrol. The proposal will ease current pressure on the local refining industry to manufacture and import 95 ULP. This, in turn, will have a positive contribution on the trade balance. The Fuel Retailers Association hasn't yet commented, but has until next Thursday to do so.
This is a massive drive by government to direct users to using 93 unleaded fuel. I think based on the results of how this turns out, there may be scope for them going forward to say, okay, well, it's worked really well there. Let's look at implementing this for 95 at the same time. I think because we're looking at lower margins on 93, it may be for them a good way to test the waters in terms of setting this maximum price and allowing retailers to set their own prices going forward.
Those are the headlines. It's back to Jane.
Thanks very much for that, Shahan. If we don't tackle climate change, South Africa will be one of the worst hit areas, and food scarcity will become a real threat. According to the UN, we've only got 12 years to get it right. Do we have the policies in place, and could land reform be part of the solution? National Agricultural Marketing Council economists Sfiso Ntumbele and Anine Erasmus, editor of Farmers Weekly. Very warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
What's our status?
I think there are various issues at play at the moment, and land reform certainly is one of the concerns, although I think on the ground maybe perhaps not even the greatest concern. Most of the areas of South Africa is now sort of out of a very prolonged drought, so definitely the impacts of climate change, and we are seeing more frequent droughts, more frequent flooding as well. So I think that is a real problem, but also then on farm level, the profitability of farmers is also having an impact on how fast we can get new players into the sector. So that is also, as far as I'm concerned, a threat to our farming sector.
And food security, obviously it has a knock-on effect there. I mean, what is our status?
At the moment, about 25% of South Africans do suffer from food insecurity, but that is, at the moment in South Africa, it's not a problem of producing enough food. We certainly, as a country, we are food secure in terms of how much we produce. For South Africa, it is really an issue of food affordability. So that's roughly a quarter of society that do suffer from food insecurity, either all the time or from time to time, is really because of the affordability of that food. And that, again, goes back to our unemployment crisis in South Africa, which agriculture can also play a role in solving.
Safisa, from your experience, food security, food stability, what is the economics at play? What are the economics at play here?
I think so one of the things which is mentioned correctly so is that South Africa does actually have the capability to produce enough food to feed itself and to also feed the nation and the rest of the continent. I think one of the biggest issues we're having in South Africa is food availability and distribution, getting food into the areas where most of the people sit and have no access into food. And that also talks to the structural issues of the agricultural sector that we have, where we're also having a production that is concentrated in some of the commercial farmers and the difficulties of bringing in the new entrants that can produce more food. And what we're also seeing that is that where there are some areas of opportunities to expand food production is the areas that where you have less investment in going in those areas because there's a lack of infrastructure, there's no reticulation of water to irrigate some of those farmland. So some of the policies that are currently being driven are trying to unblock some of those structural issues so that you are enabled to provide the support mechanism that can ensure that if you're bringing the new entrants into the value chain of the agricultural sector, are able to access those food parcels, and they can be able to take that food into the market. Because if I can just say that it's one of the other issues as well pertaining to food is the issue of wastage. The report about 2 or 3 years, I think, was released by CSIR, said that about 23% of the food that we produce goes to wastage, simply because of storage issues, especially if you're looking on the eastern coastal line of the country, where most of those producers, mainly some of them being small-scale farmers, unable to put that food into the storage, hence it goes to waste. So it's a combination of factors that needs to be attacked so that we ensure that we also increase technology and we improve our yields into the land, as you correctly said that with the climate change changing, we need to also change the way we do our production. We need to change the way we have traditionally farmed so that we can reduce some of these greenhouse gas emissions that are affecting our environment.
I mean, climate change, obviously a big factor you touched on a little bit earlier, and the stark warning by the UN. What do you think is behind that sort of warning? Obviously, that's the worst case scenario, but what do you think they'd like to see countries do in order for that not to happen?
I think that's probably the scariest thing about the report that was released this week, that it seems like such a mammoth task that you almost feel powerless in the face of what needs to happen. So now the target of capping temperature increases to 2 degrees Celsius has now been revised to trying to cap it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But even at that level, it will have a marked impact on the way in which farmers can produce food. Not only both animals and plants go into more stress because of higher heats. And that's why technology is so important in breeding new cultivars and in using new technology to breed smarter in animal production as well.
I mean, so many particularly developing countries are affected by climate change and the fact that often they're not able to get back onto their feet quickly enough because of corruption, because of the lack of technology as well, to prepare for the next eventuality.
Yeah, and I think that's why we are seeing, if we look back at, for example, the fall armyworm outbreak that we had in sub-Saharan Africa last year, and that could be argued to an extent was driven by changing climate models and climate conditions in these countries. But I think that has really brought some African countries together in understanding that there needs to, we can't win this, we can't tackle this issue as one country alone. We need to work as a region. And there is now more talks between countries to look at technologies, to look at early warning systems that can help farmers and even the smallholder farmers in other African countries cope better with new threats like a fast-spreading invasion of fall armyworm. But in terms of getting back on your feet after the drought, even commercial farmers struggle with that. And to a certain extent, a smallholder farmer can get back on his or her feet more easily because they're less exposed to depth they might have incurred in planting. So,
just for a minute, we've got a caller on the line from Alexander. Niger, go ahead.
How are you, Jane, and your guest?
Good, thank you. What's your question, Niger?
Yeah, actually, mine is just a comment. Mm-hmm. I just want to say, yes, I hear your guests are talking about food security. But the most important one is water security. Without water security, you can't have food security. So it is important that as a country, we need to actually manage our water resource very carefully. Because if we don't have water, there's no way we're going to have food. So it is very, very critical that we take care of our water as a resource, because water is a human right. So it is important that we manage our water so that we can have food security.
Okay.
And another thing is that it is important that we ensure that we comply with climate change framework, because we are also part of Kyoto Protocol. South Africa is part of Kyoto Protocol. So we need to actually educate our farmers to actually look at farming fields as part of the ecosystem, so that whatever that we do is environmentally friendly.
No,
so
you make a good point there, and that is important, isn't it, for farmers and the workers to be aware of the interconnecting relationships?
Absolutely. I mean, the water is one of the essential inputs that goes into farming itself. And when you talk about the water efficiency and also what the infrastructure I was mentioning about earlier, also creating new dams so that you can be able to supply these. Because one of the things also I think we should also acknowledge around the issue of climate change is that South Africa is part of the signatory. We talked about Kyoto Protocol, but we also now a signatory to the Paris Agreement, which is a sort of an upgrade or a latest from that Kyoto Protocol agreement, which is international trade. And there are specific programs that are now put in place, both from the government side and the private sector. Which one I can mention also, which is also the regional integration, which is the CAREP issue, which talks about saving that water and also making sure that you create value chain and you exchange of technology and the breeding cultivars that you can be able to adapt into this new climate constrained farming business. But also from the commercial farmer side, I mean, I can mention one of which is the fruit industry, which is the Confronting Climate Change program, which is also trying to now reduce some of the emissions that are are embodied into some of these products. That not only just reduces the contamination of the soil and the water that we have from the agriculture sector, but is trying to ensure that how do you produce by using less factors, whether it's less land, producing more yield, or using less water, as we know that most of our fruit coming from the Western Cape, and that's one of the provinces that have been heavily affected by drought in the last year or two.
Correct. So
there has been some of the innovation that are in place.
And do you think these agreements teach farmers to behave better? Because obviously they play a big role when it comes to sustainable farming and climate change.
You know, if we look at the sort of the international UN-led climate talks and the agreements that are in place, Kyoto, Paris, for the longest time, farmers were excluded from those talks. It's really only since 2016 that the World Farmers Organization was even given a seat at the table to talk about climate change issues. And agriculture is certainly going to be the sector most affected by climate change. And while it can definitely play part in climate change mitigation, I think what's far more important for agriculture is to find a way to respond to climate change and to adapt to it. I read just the other day that worldwide there's 100 companies that between them are contributing 75% to the carbon emissions in the world. And not one of those companies are agricultural companies. So yes, certainly the farmers are willing to do their part in employing new technologies and farming smarter in order to mitigate the amount of carbon that livestock farming or whatever type of farming is putting into the atmosphere.
And how hard is it to operate like that in an admirable fashion when you have, you know, going back to the water crisis, what we see on the Vaal River, and how much of that water has been pumped onto farms, and the sort of negative impact that has?
It becomes very difficult. I mean, water security and water scarcity is a real issue, and we have to, of course, we have to manage the water that we've got better, but first we need water to manage. Yes. So I think, you know, the real crisis that we are seeing in South Africa and probably in other parts of our region as well is that infrastructure is poorly maintained. And so it really does go back to our municipalities, local governments, and even if we have to go to the higher level, like we need more bulk water infrastructure that's not being established fast enough. And then simultaneously, the infrastructure that we do have in place needs to be maintained far better than it is at the moment.
What about the impact of land reforms and the discussions around it and the fact that nobody's really clear about how it's all going to play out? How is that affecting farmers and their workers?
I think when you're looking at the land reform, especially at least for agricultural sector, has been an issue that has been one of the top agenda of all the agricultural practitioners because of the closeness of the land issue into agriculture. And there are two elements of it. We're not necessarily taking to look at how the proposed debates on land will unfold with the constitutional processes that are in place. But what we have seen over the years is that some of the land that has been transferred from the commercial farmers into the new entrants has been to a certain extent affected by different issues, which has been either underutilized or to certain worst cases been taken out of production, which then do have an impact on to the production of food. And one of the issues that has been a lack of support into those new farmers that are coming into the region, which they are unable to access affordable financing, because that's another issue. There is a lot of instrument of finances in the country, but affordable financing is what the small-scale farmers need to access.
We've got a call on the line from Stellenbosch. Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks, Jane. Just a question to the panelists. A lot of the climate change issues that we seem to be discussing, a lot of focus is being placed on what the farmer can do to produce his products. And I'm sure Sifiso is quite aware of it. How should we be educating the consumers, especially in South Africa, to be demanding a climate, how can I say, a climate-friendly
produce?
A climate-friendly product in order to pull that product through the value chain and create those incentives for not only farmers, but all agents throughout the value chain, right up to retail level.
Yeah, good. How do we get involved?
Yes, thanks, Michael. I think one of the regulations which we're trying to look, and it also goes beyond just climate change issue, but also health issues part of it, which is we have seen like the sugar tax and some of the regulation where we're putting now standard labeling into the product so that when a consumer becomes consciously aware when he purchases a product, how much of the effort has been taken by the producers to reduce the emission embodied into that product. So I think Michael is very right that perhaps there need to be much more concerted effort to ensure that we do a lot of this consumer campaign in the local market so that we make consumers be consciously aware of the environmental side. I think if you're looking at the European Union specifically, which they talk about defensive consumption levels, where farmers first thing where consumers first thing that they look at is the labeling of the product itself, because that then tells you how much effort has been taken to ensure that they're producing environmentally friendly.
We've run out of time, but I just want to ask you a question quickly because it's going to feed into our next panel. Youth. Young farmers, how important is that for South Africa?
It's very important all over the world. Like in South Africa at the moment, as in most in Europe, in America, in Australia, New Zealand, they're seeing the same trends. That the average age of a farmer in South Africa is about 63 years old. So if we don't create an environment in which young people are both attracted to the sector and in which they are able to enter the sector where the financing is available for them at an affordable, then we're going to see, that those skill sets are just it's going to disappear. And so it's a major crisis all over the world, and we really do need to see programs specifically targeted at. I don't think it's so much about attracting the youth to agriculture. I think there are many young people interested in a career in agriculture. We need to make it. We need to enable the youth to be able to pursue a career in agriculture. We need those friendly policies, especially around financing, that gives them an opportunity to enter the sector.
So many factors at play here. Thanks for discussing them with us. Deneen Erasmus, Fiso Ntumbela, thank you.
Pleasure.
Next, we ask a 26-year-old farmer how she's become part of South Africa's solution.